All righty. Pew clock actually is running fast. This is 9:04. It's actually 9:01 according to AT&T. So we will go ahead and get ready to get started. Well, thank Freddie for filling in for a couple of Sundays. We had a really good trip. We had good weather while we were gone. And about 8 days ago, it was 88 degrees where we were. A little warmer than it is here today. So, prayer list. I know, let's see, in the bulletin, any updates on Wayne Finn? Because I know the bulletin would have been done early this week, so. It says Robin recovering from shoulder surgery. Any update? Anybody know anything about how she's getting along? We've all done turkey dressing and everything this week. Updates on Judy. She good? Okay. Yes. Ed's having a little surgery tomorrow? It's little surgery when it's on somebody else. If it's on you, it's like, oh, this is massive. Barbara, your brother, surgery still on? Okay. All right. Anybody not in the bulletin? Regina Wade? Okay. All right. Anybody else? Of course, a lot of people, I'm sure, on the road, finishing out Thanksgiving weekend, so a lot of people traveling today to and from, so a lot of people finishing out their holiday. Yes? Roy and Dana are out of the country. I understand they were at Heathrow this morning. Okay. They seem to time those trips just about the same time I take ours. So Roy and Dana. Yeah. So they're having a nice trip. Understand Colin and Ryan are not. Grandmama's handling that part. So, anybody else? Anything else? If not, Mr. Pete, could I get you to start us with prayer? Thanks, sir. All right, so we wrapped up our series on why before I was out for a couple of Sundays. So we'll begin something new this morning. This one may take us a little bit to go on and get through, but we're going to look at holding fast to our faith. Holding fast to our faith, a look at the book of Hebrews. look at the book of Hebrews. So we're going to spend some time going through and looking at holding fast to our faith. So as you look at the Bible and when it talks about holding to our faith, there are other places where it mentions it, like 1 Corinthians 16:13 says, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, and be strong. Or how about Revelation 3:11, behold, I come quickly, hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. So lots of places in the Bible about holding fast to our faith. And as we get into this morning, we're going to see that this is one of the primary purposes that Hebrews is written. Because early Jewish Christians began to what? Have issues with wanting to go back. You know, when we looked at our study in Galatians, we were talking about not going back to the previous way. So the purpose of Hebrews, the most commonly held view about the reason the book is written, was that it was an exhortation for Jewish Christians to persevere in their faith and not to abandon Christianity by returning to Judaism. So, question for you. Why were early Christians already drifting away from their faith? Christianity was new at this point, and yet there are people already drifting away and drifting back. Now, we do have the one issue of that what they're coming from, they had for what? Centuries. This had not been, Judaism had not been away for these people for just 50, 60, 70, 80 years, 100 years. It had been for centuries, for thousands of years. And in many, you know, really it was more than just a way of faith, it was a way of what? It was a way of life, wasn't it? It was their way of life.
I believe that one of the biggest reasons people drift away from their faith is that they're pulled away by false teachings.
Yeah.
And they don't study for themselves.
Yep. And we saw that when we did our Galatians study about some of the false teachings that were already slipping into the church then, and we still deal with some of those same issues today. So some reasons maybe that early Christians were having trouble with drifting away from their faith. One was persecution and loss of status. They were already being persecuted. But what about the loss of status for these people? What generally happened to a Jew who converted right off the bat? Disowned, and you were thrown out of what? The synagogue. What happened to the man that Jesus healed, and they kept asking him, what happened to you, what happened to you, what happened to you? And what they end up finally doing with him? They threw him out. And synagogue was more than just faith for these people. It was, again, part of their way of life. It was part of their family. They were not just getting thrown out of the church, so to say. They were getting thrown out of their culture. So before we get a little bit too judgmental on them, we have to understand that would be like if you remember the Rotary Club and you became a Christian, Rotary says, oh, you can't be part of that, and you're going to get thrown out of what you were doing before, and we're going to throw you out of the club too. Yeah. You know, it wasn't just being at the synagogue. It was your status in the synagogue, where you sat in the synagogue. All of that, this was all at risk for them. So it would be tempting that if you're having to endure a whole lot of persecution, a whole lot of trials, and a whole lot of difficulties, that if you can make it go away by sliding back in, that would be one of the things you'd have to deal with, because they were losing, in many aspects, everything in their life. And I think sometimes today in our culture and in our world, we don't understand what that was for them. And we don't understand what they were really giving up. How many of us, when we became Christians, gave up that level that they gave up when they became Christians? Probably I could say most of us would say, not really. So they were dealing with persecution and loss of status. Christianity was a new unsanctioned movement, while Judaism was officially recognized and protected, a protected religion, or a religio licita within the Roman Empire. Rome recognized it, so they endured it and sort of went along with it. They dealt with social isolation. They were dealing with social isolation. By accepting Jesus as the Messiah, Jewish believers were often expelled, cut off from their families, and the wider Jewish community. Resulted in social ostracism, ridicule, and a loss of identity. Tammy hit on this, a loss of identity and community structure. You just didn't get thrown out of the church. You were banished. I guess you could compare it to how they, in some extent, how they treated lepers at that time. Just go away. Get away. There was also physical hardship. The author reminds them they had already endured a great conflict of suffering, including the plundering of their property and imprisonment. We'll see that later in the book. And then returning to Judaism would have immediately relieved these external pressures and provided safety. To get away from some of the persecution they were enduring, to get away from some of the trials they were going through, all they would have had to do is say, made a mistake, I'll come back. Looking for an out. The old covenant system with its physical temple, priest, and sacrifices offered tangible, visible religion. When facing suffering, the stability and cultural acceptance of Judaism made it an attractive escape route. You go to the temple, you make a sacrifice. The priest makes a sacrifice for you. Now you're into a faith where the sacrifice has already been made once and for all for you. It's a little intangible. Judaism to them felt like more of something that they could really get their hands on. Christianity did not. There was also a lack of spiritual maturity and doubt. Pete hit on some of this a minute ago. A lack of spiritual maturity and doubt was part of the reason they were slipping away. Many believers had failed to fully grasp the significance of Christ's work, leading to spiritual apathy and doubt. Stop a minute here. Do we still have a problem with some of this today? That some people who become Christians don't really get a grasp of just what Jesus did. And maybe part of the reason that they drift away or they slip away is because they don't understand and don't have full appreciation of what he did. But many believers, even at this time, did not fully understand what had happened. Spiritual drift. The author warns them not to drift away from the gospel message. This suggests a gradual neglect of the faith where believers become dull in their hearing and fail to mature. Do most people fall off their faith cold turkey, or does it happen over time? Cold turkey seems appropriate after Thanksgiving. Over time. And I think there are those who just fall off the cliff and stop suddenly. But I think for most, yeah, Jerry, it's right. Most happen over time. You stop doing this. You stop reading the Bible as much. You stop spending as much time in prayer. Well, I missed this Sunday morning service, and then it's missed a couple Sunday morning services, or it's I don't do this. I missed helping out with this opportunity to feed some hungry. I didn't do that. It gets a little easier to miss the farther you step away. If you start out here and you're involved and you're doing things and you're deep in your faith, you're deep in the Word, you're deep in prayer, it's easy to stay on track. But then you step a little bit away in prayer, you step a little bit away in Scripture reading, you step a little bit in service, you step a little bit, and suddenly you're way over here and walking faith is way over there. And you have drifted away, which makes it then easier just to completely fall off and become dull in your hearing and slow down in your maturity. Missing the substance. They struggle to believe that Jesus' one-time sacrifice in a heavenly sanctuary was truly superior to the daily visible sacrifices performed by priests in the physical temple in Jerusalem. Think about this a minute. How much sacrificing had to go on under Judaism? It was a lot, wasn't it? Constant sacrifice. Sacrifice a bird for this, sacrifice a goat for that, sacrifice a lamb for that, sacrifice a cow for that. You had to do it in certain ways. And so they had had centuries of constant sacrifice, or the priest making the sacrifice for them. This had gone on for eons. And now suddenly, I don't have to sacrifice anymore because the sacrifice has been made one time for me. You can see where that might be a little hard to adjust to. They were tempted to return to the shadows and the types of the old law because they were easier to see and touch. And the power of doubt. The author warns against possessing an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. We'll read this in Hebrews chapter 3. The pressure and suffering led some to doubt whether Jesus was truly the fulfillment of God's promises. It's a whole lot easier to question when you're feeling pressure, when you're feeling ostracized, when you're feeling excluded, when you're feeling persecuted. Then you can really start to question, is this worth it? Now, is this really true? It becomes easier to question and easier to doubt when all of that pressure piles upon you, unless you're firmly implanted in the faith. Because of these pressures and others, many Jewish Christians were faced with the decision to either return to their former religion or make a complete break with Judaism, which is really what you have to do. You can't stay with the old, you have to go to the new. But now they're facing a choice. I either go back to what I had before, or I go completely and immerse myself in the all new. And what the writer here is getting ready to do, he's getting ready to start in this text explaining to them how the new is so much better. And that the old is just a shadow. And that's how he's going to start his defense and try to fortify them and build them up and encourage them, as saying, look, that was fine for the time, but now this is so much better. The author is trying to convince them that in becoming Christians, they had made the right choice and they needed to persevere in that choice. Is that still accurate for us today? I think sometimes where we fall short as fellow Christians, and I'm stepping on my own feet as well as everybody else, sometimes I think where we fall short as Christians and as a church is encouraging people to persevere. We do an exceptional job in trying to convert people to get them to be baptized and everything after that. But when they're struggling, when they're going through trials, we need to encourage them, persevere. Don't fall away. Don't go back to where you were. And we're not struggling with going back to Judaism and all the things like that. We're struggling with getting them to not go back to the things of the world. We become judgmental. And that is a serious, dire problem for the church today, is being judgmental. Because it is true, there but for the grace of God go I. People who have come out of drugs, people who have come out of alcohol, people who have come out of sexual situations, people who have come out of any number of things don't need judgmentalism when they're struggling. Excuse me. They need support. They need support to persevere. And that's where we need to be, like the writer's trying to be here in Hebrews, encouraging and supportive. So who wrote Hebrews? Anybody? Who wrote it? They don't know. Do people have theories? People have theories. Paul is one of the theories. Barnabas is another theory. Apollos, Timothy, I saw one when I was preparing this. Priscilla is even viewed as a possible writer. One said there are several theories as to who wrote this epistle. An unknown writer who knew Paul's writings and wrote this letter using as source material is one theory. Just some guy took Paul's stuff and put together the book of Hebrews. That's one theory. Barnabas, mentioned that. Barnabas was a Levite, so was familiar with Jewish ritual and Old Testament customs. He wrote Greek since he came from Cyprus. However, he was not known for his scholarity, but rather as a man of action, and yet his epistle was written using an educated form of the Greek language. So there is a theory that Barnabas did it, but he was more the action man than more the studious man. Apollos was a Greek scholar, an orator from Alexandria, well versed in the Old Testament as well as Paul's writings. He was well known and respected in the church. However, none of his other writings exist. And he doesn't name himself anywhere in the text. It could be his one and only writing that got through. We don't know, but you would think if this book got through, that something else that he wrote somewhere would be there. Paul, familiar with the Old Testament and the Gospel, early church fathers, Clement, Origen, and Jerome, concluded, they said it was written by Paul. The best guess, one writer said, quote, the best guess or theory is that it was originally written by Paul as a sermon, later translated into Greek by Luke, during or after Paul's death in Rome, 67 AD. Another theory. Origen, who lived from 185 to 254, one of the names we saw there, one of the early church leaders, Origen said this. After his study of the question of who wrote Hebrews, he said, but who wrote the epistle? Only God knows for sure. Only God knows who wrote it. So we don't need to get too caught up in who wrote it, because through the divine process of the Bible coming together, it ended up in the book. It begins sort of like an essay. It progresses sort of like a sermon. And it sort of ends like a letter. It's got a lot of stuff, a lot of layout in its structure here. So, when was Hebrews written? Anybody know? When was Hebrews written? We can't exactly pinpoint it, but there are some historical references that get us a time range as to when it was written. Clement of Alexandria, and that's an old picture. That's actually a different Clement, but I couldn't find the right picture. Clement, Bishop of Rome, in 96 AD, quoted from Hebrews. In 96 AD, Clement quoted from Hebrews, which tells us what? It was written before 96 AD. Could have been 95, could have been 94, but if he's quoting from it in 96, it was written before 96 AD. The year 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem and the temple are what? Destroyed by the Romans. Since the book of Hebrews deals with temple ritual at length, the fact that the event is not mentioned in the epistle strongly suggests what? That it was written before the temple was destroyed. So we started, we saw that it was before 96. By the lack of mention of the temple being destroyed, since it has to deal with a lot of stuff in the temple, we look like we're before 70. Don't you figure that if the temple had been destroyed when the author wrote this, he would have talked about a lot of the temple stuff in past tense and would have mentioned Prior to the temple's destruction, we did this. So it looks like before 70. In 33 to 60 AD, Hebrews 2, if you look at that time frame, Hebrews 2, 3, and 4, and 13 and 7 speak of leaders in the church and those who have given leadership examples in past tense. It suggests that at least a generation or two have taken place since the initial establishment of the church. So there's been a couple of, 10 to 15 year periods of leaders in the church that have come along in that time frame. Most scholars put the writing somewhere between 63 and 69 because the temple is still standing and functioning, and there has been time for generations of Christian leaders to have been raised up in the church. So somewhere likely 63 to 69 gives us the time period. Can't pin it down exactly. We don't have any scrolls with a date. This is 65. So, how does the writer approach the issue he's addressing? He's addressing the issue of these Jewish Christians wanting to drift away from the faith and drift back into Judaism. How does he approach the issue? Well, the writer compares the two religions and challenges his readers to choose once and for all which is superior. And he's going to make the points why that Christ is the superior way. But he's presenting the case. It feels like when you look at the beginning of it and some of these things, he's writing a legal defense. There is evidence for this, but there is evidence this is better. So he's presenting it and challenging his readers to choose. The writer compares Christ to various important features of the Jewish religion. He's going to compare he's going to compare Christ to the prophets. He's going to compare Christ to angels. He's going to compare a lot of things with the new to the old and show how the new is so much better. The writer lists a number of heroes who were persecuted and suffered for their faith but persevered. So as we're looking at what is better, he's going to say, look, there are these people through the time of faith, from the Old Testament up to the New, who persevered for what they believed was right. And now as he's presenting what is new and better, he's going to say we need to persevere as well. He completes the epistle with practical teaching about how to live faithfully from day to day as a Christian. So he's going to lay it out, remind them, and say, here's what you do to stay on track. Better. How many like things that are better? Who likes things that are better? I do. How many of you like to go to a restaurant that's better than the one you went to last week? How many of you, when you take a trip, you like to go somewhere better than where you went last time? Hey, how many of you like to, better is just a good thing. When you hear the word better, you think of something positive, right? Better, better, better. A key word found throughout the Epistle of Hebrews is better. Better. Christ is better than the angels, Hebrews 1:4. We enjoy the bringing in of a better hope, Hebrews 7:19. Jesus has become the surety of a what? Better covenant, Hebrews 7:22. He is also the mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. We get a double better there. Better covenant, better promises, Hebrews 8:6. So better is a key word as we get into the book. All right, so let's go to the beginning. Hebrews chapter 1. Let's turn over to Hebrews chapter 1. And verses 1 through 3. Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3. It says, long ago God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So as we get started here, he's going to address through this that Jesus is greater. The prophets were how important to Judaism? They were important leadership. They were important figures in Jewish history. So here, in the first 3 verses, he's getting to the fact that Jesus is greater than these, greater than the prophets. God was speaking when the prophets spoke. He spoke through them in different ways, dreams, visions, and writings. They sometimes gave immediate warnings, other times far-off prophecy, and they performed miracles to authenticate their divine inspiration. So the prophets weren't just nobodies. They were significant. But in this last time, God has spoken how? After speaking through the prophets previously, he now speaks to us how? Through his Son. Not the prophets, and not in various other ways, but through his Son. The revelation that he makes through his Son in these last times is greater than anything that had ever come from the prophets. What they said was big, what they said was important, what they said was great, but what Jesus says now in these last times is far superior, far more important than anything they said. Because oftentimes they were talking about who? Oftentimes they were talking about him. Note that the writer isn't saying that God didn't speak through the prophets. He did, but Jesus was the person oftentimes that they were speaking about. So, we also see that he's pointing out that Jesus is superior by his preeminence. Preeminence. How do you define preeminence? This is one of those words when you go to Webster, it's like, really? You have to do a double step. Because if you look preeminence up in Webster's dictionary, it says the quality or state of being preeminent. I'm like, all right, that helped. So preeminence is the state of being preeminent. So now we have to go to Webster again and look up what word? Preeminent. What does preeminent mean? Having paramount rank, dignity, or importance. Jesus is preeminent because there is no one higher. He is higher than the prophets. He has preeminent rank over the prophets. The writer goes on to list 3 things about the Son that demonstrates his superiority and his preeminence over the prophets. One of those is his preeminence in history. Verse 2 says, in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things. And what? And made the universe through him. Was anything made without the Son? No. So the universe was made, everything was made through him. The writer here points out that Jesus is the inheritor of all things because through him all things were made. He made it all. The earth, the moon, the stars, the universes, everything we can see, feel, touch, he made. Through all things, him were created. Through all things, he created. Jesus has a preeminent place because he is both at the beginning of history, as the agent of creation, and at the end of creation as its inheritor. Were any of the prophets here at the very beginning? Nope. Any of them still on the earth when things come to an end? Nope. So his preeminence is he is the, basically comes down to he is the Alpha and he is the Omega. He is the beginning and the end. Jesus is greater than the prophets because he is both at the beginning and at the end of time, and they lived only somewhere on a slot in between. He also is superior to the prophets because of his person. Verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. The radiance of God's glory. In discussing the personhood of Jesus, the author says things about Jesus which no one could ever say about any of the prophets. He is the radiance of his glory, which means Jesus is the light from the source, not reflected light. When they saw Moses' face glowing after he'd been on the mountain, he was reflecting God's glory. Jesus does not reflect. Jesus is the radiance of God's glory. One writer said the prophets saw and spoke of this radiance, but Jesus was the radiance. Without Jesus, the world is in complete darkness when it comes to God and salvation. God's glory, his majesty, holiness, and transcendent beauty is by nature invisible and overwhelming. Jesus is visible in the way that the invisible glory of God is made known. Jesus is the visible way that the invisible glory of God is made known to the creation. To see the Son is to see the glory of the Father. What did Jesus tell them? He said, if you have seen me, you have seen what? You've seen the Father. If you have seen him, you have seen the Father. He is also the exact representation of his nature. The idea here is that Jesus isn't a copy of God. He has the same nature as God. He is the exact representation. Is that a hard thing to grasp? That someone, or like in this case Jesus, is the exact representation of God. But that's when you've seen him. He is the representation of the Father. Fism is an that's not the right word. This is an explicit declaration that Jesus is fully God and possesses the entire divine essence, not just a partial or created likeness. He's not partial, he's not created, he is fully God. Verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and, what's it say? The exact expression of his nature. It doesn't tell us he's a partial, he's like him in this way, or he's like him in that way, or he's like him here, or he's just like him here. He says, the Bible, this verse in Hebrews 3 says what? He is the exact expression of his nature. Exact expression, the Greek word is character. Gee, what word did we get from there? The word originally referred to the mark made by a stamp or an engraving tool, like a die on a coin. It means Jesus is the perfect, essential, and exact copy of God's nature. The exact copy of God's nature. Nature, hypostasis, the term refers to God's very being or essence. He's the exact essence of God. By saying Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature, the author asserts a couple of things here at the beginning of Hebrews. One, Jesus is divine by nature. He's not a prophet, an angel, or a created being. He is God, full and perfect self-expression. Not a prophet. There are those in the world who say Jesus was just a great man or a great prophet. But what the Hebrews writer says here, he's fully God. Two, Jesus perfectly reveals the Father. The ultimate revelation God gave to humanity is not just a message, but his Son who perfectly embodies what God is. God sent himself through his Son. Writer said the prophets did supernatural things by the power of God, but they only possessed a human nature. Jesus did supernatural things because he had both a human and a divine nature. That's one of those things that just is really, sometimes hard to understand, that Jesus, fully God, fully man. It's just one of those hard things, theological notes, that he was fully human, fully God. Ever have trouble with that one? Just trying to understand that Jesus lived like we did, but yet he was still fully God, but he still understood the things we did. He still went through the things that we did. There are a lot of times you could spend talking about that. The first part of Hebrews 1:3 is one of the most powerful and profound statements in the Bible regarding the divine nature and deity of Christ, Jesus Christ. There is a strong power statement right there at the beginning. And then 3, he upholds all things by the word of his power. His power holds everything together so that nothing is allowed to totally destroy the world. What if Jesus just said, I'm going to let it go? What happens? It just all goes. He holds it together. His power, his word holds everything together. The writer said he also guides the world to its end according to his purpose, and he cannot be overtaken in this. All this is done by the power of his word or his expressed will uttered. He's far. As you look at the comparison he's making here to the prophets had nowhere close to this. I don't have time to get into this right now. We may stop there because we're about, what time anybody got? This one's a little ahead. I got 44. We'll stop there. We'll pick up here next week and continue on with this and then roll into the next section, because I don't want to skip this part, and so I don't want to shortchange it either. So we'll stop here. We'll look at Colossians 1:15-20 as we continue on next week, and we are out of time.